Hello, good people of Earth, good living people. Today, in Violent Earth, we are going to pick up with our discussion, our primary focus now being life. So, as we move through some of these violent events, you can bet your good old tuchus that it's going to get violent for living things out there too, right? So, the title today is Life and Death. A natural part of life is death. A natural part of the earth, as we've seen, is business as usual and big old catastrophes. That in now this case, when there's living things that can die, they will die. Okay, all right. Don't want to get too intense on death here. Let's slow down for a second. So let's paint the background a little bit. Let's talk about paleobiology, paleo for ancient biology, and maybe a little discussion following the last discussion on the origins of life and then the rise of atmospheric oxygen. And we'll pick up about there and we'll see what critters have been up to for the last billion years or so. Then I want to talk about a specific time called the Devonian time period and a specific organism within that time. And then we'll also talk about one of the, first crises, Earth-scale crises with algae, essentially, with some of these organisms. I'll put this link in the notes below, but this was actually old now. I should have removed this before today. But a few years ago, these two gentlemen, Dave Blanchard and Dave Miller, caught me or stopped me. Actually, they called me out. On Interstate 95, they were doing a segment for Think Out Loud on the road for Oregon Public Broadcasting. And they asked me to come out and talk a little bit about the Oahe, geology of the Oahe. It was kind of nice little 2-minute segment there. I'll make sure that's available for you. All right, our time spiral here. Cosmic web, accretionary disk, sun igniting, hydrogen turning into helium. Our first big violent event, the giant impact hypothesis, a layered Earth, tectonics of Earth, business as usual volcanism like Mount Mazama blowing her top, making Crater Lake. We talked about the supercontinent cycle of the sort of accordion system of cratons splitting apart and coming back together every single time, getting wider as they accrete material and thicker as they go through orogeny or mountain building processes. We did talk about the snowball Earth event, another pretty violent event that took hundreds of millions of years of violent frozen wastelands of Earth. Now, a little bit less violent than the snowball Earth, we also talked about the Pleistocene ice ages and some of the great fantastic beasts like Titanus that lived during that time. We took an excursion to talk about, again, the heliosphere impacting the rest of the five other spheres of the Earth, and asteroids or bolides coming from extraterrestrial origins have had devastating effects on the Earth, not just in the Earth processes like forming a moon and tilting the Earth, but also to life here on Earth. And we took that sort of discussion to talk a little bit about a whole lot about geologic evidence and looking for these kind of things. And now that leads us to the last discussion of life in general and how early life, had begun changing the face of this planet about the first minute it got here. Well, okay, the first billion years. It got here, it started to change the planet. So let's take that as context of where we're moving forward, of looking at life actually changing the face of the Earth. Okay, pretty cool stuff. All right, back up a little bit. This is a recap of kind of where we've been and a little bit more of a linear progressive timeline. So back in the Hadean, let's see, okay. Back in the Hadean, 4.6 to 4 billion years ago, hell on Earth. Sometime during that, 4.48 billion years ago, we have the giant impact event, the moon forming event. But then by the late Archean, I argued that we have the origin of amino acids and then therefore the building blocks of life in soils, in clays. This is, of course, based on many others' work. This isn't just my rogue hypothesis out there. That being my preferred hypothesis for the origins of life on any planet. Then, by 3.5 billion years ago, we know that life existed on this planet in enough quantity that it was messing with the sedimentary structures of the planet, making microbial-induced sedimentary structures. Then we took into account that those organisms, some of which are photosynthetic, and they're excreting poisonous gas out into the atmosphere called oxygen. Poisonous to all of the organisms that lived previous to them. And gaining not necessarily a tolerance to that, but genetic diversity and not killing themselves. Slowly, those photosynthetic organisms also became oxygen-tolerant organisms, and they began to be able to tolerate their own waste, becoming the most dominant organisms, and then producing volumes and volumes of oxygen into the atmosphere, causing the great oxidation event. For the better part of 500 million years, the Earth was just an iron sequestering machine. Well, maybe not that extreme, but iron, as large banded iron deposits, started accumulating on the bottom of the oceans because of this great oxygenation event. Then, now this is placed, of course, a little bit earlier in the class, but this is where this comes in now, is after the great oxygenation event, we have about 1 billion years later, the cryogenian event, or the snowball Earth, the Sturtian and Marinoan glaciations that occurred during this time. The Huronian glaciation occurred longer before this. These two pulses of glaciers, which I showed you plenty of evidence for, both here in the Whopper, the boulder, and the glacial diamictites and the cap carbonates here, those inevitably had a very large impact on life. If we look at life overall, after the snowball Earth event, it's a mere couple 100,000 years later, 100 million years later, that the Ediacaran life goes on a dramatic increase of diversity until hitting the Cambrian, where there's an explosion of life. Okay, we've used that word once before, well, probably many times, but explosion of minerals that came after oxygenation of the atmosphere and the continents. Now, we also here now are going to talk about an explosion of life that occurred about 540 million years ago, known as the Cambrian explosion. So this is what life has been up to for most of our class so far, except for when we talk about dinosaurs or Ice Age beasts. Pretty much nothing is going on for life. We've talked about the early planet, basically void of any significant life forms. Okay, very significant because they're making oxygen. But what I mean is any large fossilized organisms or even complex communities that might be referred to as an ecology. So far, ecology is this sphere of the Earth, the ecosphere, is a very small, minute portion of the Earth, but it is making big effects on the others. So let's take a giant leap forward in life and start talking about these fossilized organisms that are much more, that are common in the rock record for the last 550 million years. All right, starting off with, this is, I don't know why I crammed these all into one slide. I should probably expand these out for you, but of course this is available on Canvas and you'll be able to look at these in more detail. During the Cambrian is really the beginning of calcified life. By calcified, I mean that mineral, calcium carbonate, the one that makes up limestones on Earth. That calcium carbonate material, organisms got, they were able to adapt to use calcium carbonate as a protectorate, or as some way to be able to protect themselves from what would have been predators naturally, right? Also, there's these organisms, the trilobites, a specific one of those calcified organisms that isn't just calcifying itself for protection or maybe locomotion, but also it's calcifying its eyes. the trilobites are the first things to have some sort of sensory eyeball-looking thing that were probably made of calcite, which is a mineral that has this really interesting optical property that it splits light. It refracts light into two different pathways. So if you have a clear calcite crystal, you can put it up to a page and it'll double the writing on the other side. So interestingly, the trilobites, they're using the properties of calcite in multiple ways. In this point, I'm pointing out light, the way that it interacts with light to make a sensory organ that we now know as an eyeball. This was not an eyeball. This was not an early eyeball or anything, but this was the foundation of a light interacting crystal that was connected to a nervous system that the organism could then respond to those sensory inputs of light. Now, this isn't all that far off from organisms that are responding to light by going like this, basking in the energy-rich light and then producing sugars. I mean, we just talked about organisms that are responding to light, and they're manifesting energy out of it, right? So it's not a far cry from what organisms were already doing, responding to light. But in these organisms, they're now using that response to light to manipulate their own lives. Not just using it as an energy source, because trilobites aren't photosynthetic. They're hunters, right? They're gatherers. They're filter feeders. They either filter the bacteria that are in the water or in the sand, or they hunt things that are eating that bacteria, like gastropods or snail shells. So the trilobites are now using light in a different way, in a sensory organ type of way. And this is really cool. This is beautiful stuff. Now, we know about trilobites because they're hard. They're hard, shelly parts. Now, in the fossil, in the ways to fossilize, if something gets trapped in a silt deposit, the soft, gooey stuff, like say my skin or my flesh, that's the stuff that bacteria are going to eat that is going to get dissolved away really quickly. Soft parts don't preserve very well. However, hard parts like bones or shells preserve really well in the fossil record, right? I mean, that's what we find of the dinosaurs. We find a whole bunch of dinosaur bones, not a whole lot of dinosaur muscle and intestines, right? So hard parts preserve well. Trilobites are made of hard parts, so they preserve well. Well, for the longest time, that gave us an unbalanced look at early life, that they were mostly these shelly organisms. But the Burgess Shale in Canada is this very perfect fossil preservation site called the Lagerstätten, or Conservat Lagerstätten. I think it's a Conservat. And what that means is that means it has superb fossil preservation environment. That means that the stuff that was depositing didn't decay away, the bacteria there didn't eat it away, that it was depositing so quickly that it couldn't oxidize away, that organisms couldn't tear the other dead things apart, so they weren't broken up into a billion pieces. And in those Burgess Shale deposits, the community of life that's preserved at that time looks more like the top picture. Sponges and weird-looking non-calcified corals and sea scorpions and trilobites and all this other stuff that you wouldn't see in other Cambrian Age rocks because they're sandstones or they're rocks that don't preserve soft parts very well. So in the Cambrian, not only did it appear that there was an explosion of calcified life, but that's only like 10% of the ecology that was around at that community. So there literally was an explosion or a diversification of life across all genera and taxa of the known, or of what flourished out of that, the tree of life. Okay? It was the Cambrian that had the largest explosion from not very much life to a whole bunch of different types of life, all within a couple tens of millions of years. That's why the Cambrian is referred to as the Cambrian explosion. Now, we're going to go through the geologic time periods here. the Cambrian, then the Ordovician and Silurian, COS, and then the Devonian we'll get to. The Ordovician and Silurian, just to quickly say something about those here. This is sometimes known as the Age of Fishes, the Silurian, because this was the origin of bony fish, where fish began, if there were fish and fish-like things before that didn't have bones, they weren't preserving all that well, fleshy, fishy things, right? Now, bony fish, however, have incredibly good odds of preservation because they're bony. Even if they're made of cartilage or even if they're more soft tissue, soft bony tissue, it's still hard enough that it increases the chances for preservation. So we know that during the Silurian, fish blossomed onto the scene. During the Ordovician, similarly, there was a blossoming of the gastropods, or of the snails, that existed during this time, the late Cambrian. But during the Ordovician, they saw a whole bunch of niches open up that they could do all sorts of things. So shelly life began to dominate the ocean floor. The things that are moving around on the floor, that are attached to the floor bottom, that are filter feeding, all of those types of life that are using shells to protect themselves seem to be winning. They're doing really well. Of course, they're getting eaten by predators like eurypterids and things like this we'll talk about in a little bit. Also, there are these sea lilies. They're oftentimes called today, I think, the modern day sea lily. But I like to make sure to, and every geology class is talking about the fossil record. It's always really rich to not only talk about trilobites, but talk about crinoids. These things are actually still living today. They're related to sea stars and to feather stars of the ocean. The echinoderm or echinodermata, starfish. And these things, they have these segmented stems. They almost look like the stem of a flower. And these segments preserve really well in the geologic record. They actually look like little round discs or little kind of coiny looking things, the crinoids. And then on top of those stacks of discs, they almost look like vertebral discs, is this almost flower-looking structure, the calyx. Calyx or corolla, I think it's the calyx, and then the feathery bits kind of wish around and they filter feed using this net between their appendages, their 5 appendages, to catch anything that's in the water. Now, this was a sessile type, or it sat on the ocean floor and did this kind of thing. But today, the sea lilies that are existed in the ocean today are actually, they can move, right? They're not attached to the ground. They can actually move around and filter feed and move from predators and stuff like that. It's pretty darn neat. This is an organism with no eyes, right? Like the trilobites. So the Silurian, we have the rise of calcified life. Okay, just about had a fatal battery mistake there again. So I had to move the camera a little bit and plug it in. So moving forward from the Ordovician and Silurian, the Devonian time period, this is a wild time period for life. Everything that we've talked about before is pretty much happening in the oceans. I mean, with the exception of the whole clay hypothesis of origins of life thing, happening in soils, wet soils on the margins of seas. The Devonian, life sees its return back to the soils or back to the dry land. Life is that was existent in the ocean, the shelly creatures, the trilobites, the gastropods, the fish. Finally, by this time, the lobed fin fish, or those that have rigorous enough bony arms or bony appendages that they can hop from mud puddle to mud puddle, or they can get out of the water and go across dry land to another area. Okay, now this was revolutionary in the Earth processes too. Now I want to point something out that I said last lecture, which is why organisms, microbes, could not be on the surface of the land but probably had to be in the subsurface or in the ocean, and that's from radiation coming in from the heliosphere. Ultraviolet radiation, bombarding these organisms and killing them if they get to the surface and bombarded by them. But oxygen in the atmosphere, this new particle that life itself has allowed to flourish in the atmosphere and sequester iron while that's occurring, oxygen in the upper atmosphere, when that's hit by radiation, can undergo an ionization process and break up some of those oxygens, ionize them, but also form a new molecule, ozone. O3, 3 oxygen molecules that are bonded together. Ozone, I hope you've heard of this word, and I'm sure that you have. Ozone is like the sunscreen of the Earth. It's what's up there in the stratosphere that is protecting the Earth from ultraviolet rays, from ultraviolet A, I think is the whole variety. There's harmful ultraviolet rays that are coming in, and they get blocked by the selective absorber ozone in the stratosphere, and only a few of those rays make it into the lower atmosphere that then, do give us potentially not just sunburn, right, but potentially can be harmful or cancerous to our cells, those UVs that can really break up our cellular DNA. Now, the reason I say this is now we're talking about life coming back on land. How could that be? We have ultraviolet rays. No, we don't. Remember, way back here, oxygen was put out into the atmosphere and the ozone layer was created. The ozone layer hasn't been something that Earth was born with or ever had. It was something that was created. Well, created may be a strong term. I'm reserved to use that, but it was something that formed out of the product, the waste product, by oxygen flatulent organisms. Okay, so this is kind of coming back around now, life coming back onto land. It could only come back onto land after the ozone was that strong. So now this is still a time where fish are ruling the sea, okay? This is still a time where now the community of life under the ocean, under DC, is a rich community of predators, right? You have all these other things that are just going to be living there, eating stuff no matter what. But now this is the time of ocean predators, where ocean predators are getting big and bad and scary, like this guy, like the Dunkleosteus fish. Not her, that's my daughter, she's cute. But behind my daughter, about 4 times the size of her little head when she was 3 or 4 years old, the Dunkleosteus, a fish that is entirely armored on its front. Not a skull, it's not an armored skull. It's like the outside, the whole thing is one big plate of armor. Even its eyeball. Its eyeball. Now, eyeballs have come a long ways, of course, with bony fish after the trilobite. But the eyeball of the Dunkleosteus is calcified. Just in case anything pokes it in the eye, it can withstand that poking and then go on to eat the thing that poked it in the eye, right? It's strong. All right, so we have Dunkleosteus that rules the scene. If I was swimming in the Devonian Ocean, I'd want to get out of there. Well, this guy had the same idea, right? I mean, not just like that. But the lobe-finned fish that I had mentioned started to make it onto land. Now, this is a long evolutionary process over tens and 20s of millions of years that led to what's known as the first amphibian. The first amphibian to make it on land is very, very fish-like. Here it looks a little bit more like a crocodile or a smashed salamander skull. I don't know. But that is the original, or at least a picture of some of the original amphibians that we have identified in the rock record. Now we'll come back to the Devonian in a little bit. I want to talk about this time period, the Carboniferous, which is kind of a combination of, here in the United States, we call this the Mississippian and the Pennsylvanian, but most of the world smashes these together as a time called the Carboniferous. Why Carboniferous? Well, the first bit there says it all. Carbon. Carbon, 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 carbon. When you look at these rocks in the rock record, guess what you find? Carbon. Tons of carbon was sequestered in the soil during this time. Soil, yeah, soil. So soil forming processes, as we've talked about them thus far, rainwater forming clays that filter down to a zone of accumulation. Now, what if you have an area where the soil is forming, but it's a waterlogged soil, like a bog or a swamp or a lagoon? There's still formation of the substrata that's happening under there, okay, first and foremost. But also, in some cases, those swampy areas, if there's any dead organic material that falls into those swampy areas, if there's not a new influx of fresh water, oxygenated water, that comes into that area, then that stagnant water, we all know what stagnant, swampy water smells like, right? That stagnant water that's there encourages it encourages bacteria that are anaerobic. Anaerobic. Not aerobic, not oxygen-respiring bacteria that need oxygen to break things down, but all the anaerobic bacteria that tend to stink when they release their stinky stuff on the end. I believe it's an anaerobic bacteria that eats our body, our sweat out of our glands and turns that into the foul smelling we call body odor. That might be a bad example. But another really rich example then is a swamp, an area where you have that black sludgy stuff that's not really decaying very well. It smells like decay and rot, but there's not enough oxygen for the real rotters of the earth to do their job. What do I mean by the real rotters of the earth? I mean not just bacteria, but fungi. Ah, yeah, you knew it was coming eventually, right? Fungi coming on back around. Fungi of the world are like the Earth's recycling machine of carbon. They take anything that's made of carbon and they secrete enzymes and they rip all that carbon apart and they distribute all those nutrients around the forest or around wherever, around back into the environment. And in turn, they also get nutrients and they get sugars as well. So they are the decomposers of Earth. But fungi breathe oxygen just like we do. We're actually more closely related to fungi than we are to plants. Plants are photosynthetic. They make their own food. Fungi and animals, we have to seek out our own food and go find it and eat it. Or decay it, right? Decompose it. So during the Carboniferous time period, these swampy areas where all these logs and all this Carboniferous age forest, now after the Devonian, after life has made it onto land, plants have just flourished, and you have these non-vascular plant trees, glyptodon, glysoparia. I'll correct that in just a minute. These trees, Glysopteris, these trees that are very big, and there's all this vegetable matter that's falling to the ground all around them. And in these swampy areas, the main, the main decomposers of Earth, they can't decompose things very well. The fungi, they can't decompose stuff in a swamp, so it accumulates, and it accumulates, and it accumulates, and it accumulates. So not only could fungi not work very well in a swamp with a lack of oxygen, but what if this is stuff that's outside of the swamp? You'd think that fungi could decompose it there, right? Logs are falling, and they're falling, and they're falling, and you would think, just like any normal forest, that the fungi would eat that. However, these crazy Carboniferous trees, these crazy organic things, created a new organic molecule to bring themselves some rigid structure, right? Everything before this were small little things that, like bryophytes or like lycopodon or moss, things like this that didn't really have the ability to stand up erect like a shrub or a tree. Now, the material lignin, an organic compound, was, let's just anthropomorphize here, invented by trees to give them structure. And that new stuff, lignin, fungi had never seen before, right? We've talked about this stuff before, right? New stuff in the environment is scary, right? All the other organisms are like, I don't know, I've never seen that stuff before, I don't know what to do. Well, similarly to the Earth never seeing oxygen before and sequestering iron as iron oxides, fungi had never seen lignin before. So all this carbon that's falling is not decaying. It's not going anywhere. The fungi can't do their job because they're baffled about how to break down this new stuff. So the Carboniferous time period is named such because all of the rocks of the Carboniferous time period that you look at are full of coal. Well, maybe not all of them and maybe not full, but there's still a lot of coal deposits, Pennsylvanian, Mississippian, that are deposited during this time that led to the Industrial Revolution. It was those deposits that were easily accessible that fueled a lot of the Industrial Revolution, Carboniferous age coal. Okay, so out of the Carboniferous, that's the almost the end of the Paleozoic, the Mississippian, the Pennsylvanian, Carboniferous, and then the Permian. The Permian was a really interesting time of life because now life on land isn't just crawling on. It's not brand new. It's not even in its maturity phase. It's full-blown, mature ecological life, right? Life is probably present on all continents. It is present on all continents by now. There are amazing niches that are being born out of a new flower, or well, not flowers. I didn't say flowers. Out of a new tree that's growing over here, a new thing that's over here. There's all these new communities of life that are able to do this thing together. So this is probably and arguably when life, if we were transported back to the Permian, that though the organisms might look weird and the continents look different and stuff just looks different, this is life that's recognizable. Now, not that the Carboniferous wasn't. The Carboniferous is just strange, right? Where you have high amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which gave rise to gigantic insects. There's also high amounts of oxygen in the atmosphere. So gigantic insects and big Carboniferous forests, weird-looking trees, a lot of foreign stuff. But by the very end of the Paleozoics, things start to kind of look like we might recognize them, right? Like, oh, okay, closer to dinosaurs, maybe. And in fact, that is one of the lasting legacies of the Permian, is we see the split between the reptiles, where one of these lineages goes on to become mammals, and one of these lineages continues as reptiles, one of those clades of reptiles becoming the dinosaurs, right? Or the, what are they called? The Sauroniciids, right? Any of those types of reptiles. Now, those are not including things like lizards and alligators and turtles. Those are on a separate split over here. But the two organisms that split here are those that became dinosaurs and those that became mammals. Okay, this is the Dimetrodon, which is oftentimes shown. I remember this from Land Before Time. And the Dimetrodon is not a dinosaur. It's earlier than dinosaurs. And it's actually not even it's a predecessor to dinosaurs, but it's not a direct ancestor of dinosaurs, because that's actually a direct ancestor of us, of mammals. The Dimetrodon is more closely related to us than it was to Tyrannosaurus Rex, to my knowledge. All right, so that's the Paleozoic. Now, of course, you know the story of the Mesozoic. We'd actually gone through that in quite detail. You have the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous, and the Cretaceous being the time, the apex of the dinosaurs, and then boom, it all came crashing down when an asteroid hit the Earth and wiped them out. So that story we've been through. You're familiar, at least to a certain extent, with Mesozoic life. I'm not going to go into that in a lot more detail, maybe one more organism. And then after their extinction, of course, we get to the Cenozoic, which I made a large case or a lot of, gave you a lot of details on focusing on birds after the end of the dinosaurs, because birds today, avian dinosaurs are the remnants from the Cretaceous. They are the dinosaurs of the modern era. So some people would argue that the Cenozoic is the age of mammals, like the Mesozoic was the age of dinosaurs. Now, I wouldn't say that the Cenozoic is the age of mammals. Yes, mammals have diversified into a lot of niches. They're very cool creatures. But birds have specialized into a lot of different niches as well. So some people might say the Cenozoic is the age of birds, and also the insect-flower relationship. The angiosperms that rose during the late Mesozoic and the insects that have been around since the Carboniferous, even into the Devonian, they begin to have this really unusual relationship of specialization between them. That certain angiosperms or flowers develop specifically for a specific insect to spread their pollen. It's very interesting stuff. Okay, so that's a little bit of a large rundown of just life in general. Let's take a look at that Devonian stuff again. I want to go back now to talk specifically about some stuff that was going on during the Devonian. So here's a better artist rendition of the early amphibian-looking things, the Acanthostega, kind of I guess it looks more like a what do you call those things, a newt or a salamander today than we might think of other amphibians. And then here's that Dunkleosteus, right? Here's my daughter next to the Dunkleosteus skull. And then in the Devonian oceans also, for a long period of time, there had existed these, sometimes they're called sea scorpions, I think, but the Eurypterids, that are also predators of the ocean, but they're arthropods, right? So they're more like insect life. So they're exoskeleton rather than having an internal skeleton and a similar nervous system. So here you have your vertebrate predator and then your invertebrate predator. So both of these predators looking pretty badass. I mean, here's like some of the largest Eurypterids out there. Here's a human for scale. I mean, you got some pretty nasty creatures that are living in the ocean, some pretty nasty predators. So there's no wonder that life started to come out of the out of the water. I mean, I don't mean to put so much exaggeration on the idea of like, oh, there's scary stuff in that water, I don't want to go in there, and that they crawl out onto the land. Now, that's just an extra environmental pressure. The main environmental pressure is food, right? That's what life diversifies into. Where can I find food? 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 And it's going to go to where the food is, right? So these creatures, again, the lobefin fish originally, but then followed by their predecessors, the amphibians, are seeking to go onto land to follow the new food sources that they're finding on land. Well, what's on land, right? Plants, fungi that are breaking down the plants, and of course, insects that are eating the plants or eating the fungi. So you start to have this rich community of life on the surface, even though it's a small community of little things, but somebody's got to eat them. And who's going to eat them but a vertebrate? So you begin to have vertebrates coming out of the ocean onto land because of several environmental pressures, food, and predation. Now, this is a good picture of what the Devonian looked like in my eyes, right? But not just my eyes, but this is a good picture of what an artist's rendition of the Devonian fossil record looks like. So here's your Eurypterids down here in the shallow ocean seas. And then here's all these little tiny shrub-like things, these little tiny delicate plants that are out there. And they're pretty much the only thing living out there, except for these gigantic towering organisms that are up to 3 meters in length, 10 feet. And what are these? It says it right up here. The most common hypothesis about these things in the literature, which is still very debated and heavily debated in today's paleontology literature, is that these things were the fruiting bodies of a fungi. So the fruiting body of a fungi is what's known as a mushroom. Yes, during the Devonian, about 410 million years ago, the earth may have been dominated by a 10-foot mushroom species, okay, called Prototaxites. Now, one thing you should know about fungi is that fungi isn't just the mushroom. That's just the fruiting body. That's just the sex organ, if you will, of the whole fungal organism. Fungi lives underneath the ground in a large network of these kind of cobwebby looking strings called mycelium. They can be as thin as 1 cell thick. So these very thin cobwebby networks. And what are they doing under there? Again, they are the decomposers of earth. They're taking these plants as they die, and they're decomposing those things and making soil humus out of it, right? So fungi are really good at building the humus within soils. Not building the soil profile, the clays, but instead building the organic material within that soil and binding all of that stuff together, which of course we think, as farmers, we think that as rich soil. So the Prototaxites fungi is living in this complex, or in this organism community, ecological community, decomposing these things and then fruiting and sending its stalk or its stike 10 feet possibly into the air and releasing its spore load to be spread circumboreally around the world. And these fossils are found in several Devonian sections around the world. Here's one of these fossils. I believe this is in Iran. This was on the cover, a cover photo of the GSA Today back about a decade ago. And then in the background is another artist rendition of the Prototaxites fungi in the smaller plants that lived during that time. So during the Devonian, again, this is a very cool time period. You have life that has returned back to land, starting with things like fungi, liverworts, lichen, probably, and then predating or eating those things. You have insects. And then eating all of those things, you have amphibians that make their way onto land for 425 million years ago. And within that community, you also have one of the strangest creatures, the strangest fungi of all time, the Prototaxites, a 9-meter feature. So here's one of those fossils, and again, just to point out that this is debated in the geologic literature, but it's weird. Whatever it is certainly something weird, and this is, a good amount of what the literature suggests is a giant fungi. So this Devonian landscape is weird. If you go backwards 100 million years, what does this landscape look like? It's completely bare. It's just rock. Maybe some lichen here or there. It's just getting started. But there's no fossil record for that. The fossil record suggests that it is the early Devonian when life gets a foothold on the earth. And what happens over the course of this 50 million years is that life now has sunk its teeth, its roots, into the earth and begins to break down the earth in a new way. Remember, we saw oxygen began to oxidize the earth's minerals, right? A new corrosive agent that could weather those materials. Well, guess what? Life comes with its own corrosive agent. Not only the roots and the action of roots, but those roots secrete enzymes. Those roots and the fungi secrete acids, organic produced acids that are breaking down the rock substrate to absorb those nutrients. The plants want to absorb nutrients because they need things to make their cell walls out of, and they want to, have a complex, sporulation. The fungi are transporting those nutrients. There's all sorts of reasons why life needs a potassium ion or a sodium ion or a chlorine anion here and there. So that is occurring by the acid breakdown of life on land. Well, we saw what happened last time life introduced something new into the environment, and guess what happens this time? Of course, we get the change of the biosphere. Here's a modern day fungi that looks similar to Prototaxites. Okay, so here's some of these, the Archaeopteris, I think that's probably the name that I was looking for earlier. The ancient tree from the late Devonian and Walton Formation in Hancock, New York. And this shows kind of the evolution of these tree-looking things, of the Archaeopteryx, from relatively simple land tree organisms to then actually fairly complex with a height of a meter or so. Or here's 5 meters, 5, 10, 15, 20 meters tall. Holy moly. So we see that organisms are becoming more and more complex, and along with them is those organic acids. Organic acids are released by soil organisms to soil solution, like the plant roots, acetic acid, citric acid, soil microbes receiving these fungi, oxalic acid. That affects weathering in 2 ways. That contributes to the total acidity of the soil, so it adjusts the pH of the soil, but also any class of coordination of complex compounds consisting of a central metal atom attached to a large molecule called a ligand in a cyclic or ring structure. So these acids are attacking things that have metals associated with. They can rip apart those bonds away from those central metal anions. Okay, things like olivine, right, that has magnesium and iron as a core part of its structure, or all of these silicate minerals that we've talked about, except for maybe pure silica that's relatively untouchable by this process. So it has been proposed in the late Devonian, the oceanic anoxic events and the biotic crisis were rooted in the evolution of vascular plants. Okay, let's back this up a little bit. I just threw out now a GSA Today title that's supposed to say something to you after I told you all this other stuff. Okay, let's build it back. Organic acids are now weathering the continent at a much higher rate. That weathering, just like we talked about with banded iron formations, all those ions are going out into the ocean. All of these nutrients are going out into the ocean, out into the ocean, out into the ocean. Well, what happens with all these nutrients is that the relatively primitive species, the bacteria, the blue-green algae, they are absorbing those nutrients, and then, of course, what happens is that they poison their environment once again, and as they're absorbing all this material, they take the oxygen out of the environment, which leaves an anoxic environment below. So this is a process called eutrophication that occurs on Earth today every time that the Mississippi delivers a huge load of silt and pesticides and herbicides down the Mississippi. All of these materials then become raw materials for algae and other bacteria to feed off of, which causes an anoxic zone in the lower portions of the Gulf of Mexico, areas where fish can't live, where nothing can live because there's no oxygen in the environment. So what this is suggesting here is that the late Devonian had an anoxic event and a biotic crisis related to the evolution of vascular plants because of the production of these acids. Okay, so here's eutrophication. Excessive richness of nutrients in body of water, frequently due to runoff from the land, which causes a dense growth of phytoorganisms, in this case algae, and death of animal life from the lack of oxygen. Here's a good little diagram from today's eutrophication events that occur that suggests that this cuts off oxygen from the lower stands. And then today, or not exactly today, but today we often hear of algal blooms in, say, creeks, not creeks, in reservoirs or in lakes, any area where the water can be relatively stagnant. then a type of algae, a dinoflagellate, I think they're called, that can grow on the surface. It produces some toxins into the environment. So we're not supposed to swim in those types of algae, right? Those reddish types of algae. So it should be familiar to you that algae have the capabilities of changing the chemistry of a body of water to be toxic to life in their surroundings. And eutrophication is certainly no exception to that process. A few years ago, this was the scene on the coast of China, that a large algal mat from a process like this actually came onto the beach and just made a nasty looking beach. But this algae was created from an algal bloom from a river that was dumping nutrients out, and then the algae produced all of this stuff way out in the ocean, but the winds were able to blow it back inward. So it's not happening right on the coastline, but was then blown in coastline. So this event then is what's known as the Devonian Extinction event. This is another mass extinction that happened by this cascading process, just like the Banded Iron Formation events of oxygen being put out into the oceans and poisoning things and getting rid of 49 of the previous organisms that existed, right? Similarly, we'll look at the criteria for mass extinction in a minute, but similarly, what's happening here is that these vascular plants are producing a cascade event that's becoming detrimental to other organisms and many other organisms. So first of all, this happened in two pulses. The Kilwasar event that killed 50% of all genus of organisms, 19% of all families. And then later, to add insult to injury, the Hagenberg event, the eutrophication event that killed off many land organisms then as well. Because if you have the cutoff from the ocean to the land, if you sever the relationship between those two, all land organisms are also essentially based on oceanic organisms, or at least processes that are occurring in the ocean. So cutting off the ocean or killing the ocean kills organisms on land. Okay, so the Devonian extinction then is the first of the fossilized mass extinctions that we've talked about in this class. Earlier, we talked about of course, the Banded Iron Formations and those microbes leading towards the very first mass extinction, but we have no fossil evidence of that. We don't know how many microbes existed before oxygen came around. We just sort of suppose that there were many types because we still see several types that made it through. But there were likely lots of other things that then went extinct. We will never know. They're gone, and they didn't leave fossils behind. However, during the Devonian, there were enough creatures that left their fossilized remains before the extinction, and then they went extinct, and after the extinction, during now the Carboniferous, the organisms that begin to repopulate the Earth during the Carboniferous are kind of different than those from the Devonian, meaning that 50% of the species that existed during this time didn't exist during this time. Okay? Where usually there should be like you exist here, then you exist here, you exist here. But half of things went extinct in that first pulse of the event. So I think it's time to talk about this charming topic of mass extinctions. Because let me tell you, there's nothing more charming than talking about on a first date than mass death. Right? Am I right? No, I'm a little right, a little wrong. I don't know. Give it a try. So we'll go through these next couple of slides here. What's their time looking like? We're at 36 minutes. Not bad. So first of all, I should say one thing about, let me not say that thing about the fossil record. What I just mentioned was that before an extinction, life looks like this, and after an extinction, life looks like this. So in the rock record, if you see fossils and then different fossils, and those same fossils go for another 100 meters or something, that line right there would be a great place to say, wow, stuff that way is a lot different than stuff that way. Let's draw a relatively arbitrary boundary here to say those things are different than those things. And this was the beginning of the geologic time scale. This is how we separate the Paleozoic from the Precambrian. Remember the Cambrian explosion of life? Of course, then, the fossils after the explosion of life look much different than before the explosion of life, where there was relatively nothing. So all that stuff is Precambrian. That's pre-fossils. That's pre-stuff down there. And then after this, that is the Phanerozoic, or the visible life starts 542 million years ago. So that's a great place to draw that boundary. What I'm saying here with the Devonian is that once this mass extinction occurred, the Devonian looks different than the Carboniferous. Bam! There's the definition of Devonian and Carboniferous. So early geologists were able to make a fossil record based on the appearance and disappearance of fossil ecologies or fossil assemblages. And that's really how we got the names that we have today: Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic, Ordovician, Silurian. All of those things are based on a certain fossil assemblage that was relatively common throughout this number of millions of years, say during the Ordovician. But then something changed and gave way to the Silurian species. Okay? Now, not every one of those something changed is a mass extinction. But a mass extinction is a very obvious place to draw that boundary. Okay? Like the biggest mass extinction of them all, the Permo-Triassic mass extinction. The transition between the Paleozoic, ancient life, and the Mesozoic, or medium life, or middle life, the time of the dinosaurs. Now, we just talked about this with Dimetrodon, and then leaving behind that split and talking about dinosaurs. So here's what really happened during that time. Okay? Not that what I just told you wasn't true, but here's what was really going on during the Permian. Is you have the rebound from the Carboniferous, right? All those trees that were accumulating and accumulating and accumulating. Fungi finally figured out how to break that stuff down, so the Carboniferous time period ended. No more deposition of a bunch of dirty black stuff, right? Instead, when that stuff falls, it gets decomposed. But all that stuff that's down there is locked in the fossil record. It's been accumulating for millions of years by this point, so it's well on its way to becoming rock, or to becoming coal. Now, during the Permian, there was a really interesting volcanic event that happened in Siberia. And this is outlined in black right here. Huge, huge area of Siberia. Just for reference, right, here's the far eastern side of Siberia, the Kamchatka Peninsula. And then here's the far western side where we get to the Scandinavian countries. So this takes up most of Siberia from side to side, right? And that volcanic event, we've talked about these before, the Deccan traps, the Columbia River flood basalts, which is a relatively small one. But we've talked about these huge expanses of lava before called flood basalts. And these, the Siberian traps, were no different. Well, they're a little different because they are the biggest one, like ever. Well, I don't know about ever, but they are by far the biggest one on land during the Paleozoic. Pretty darn sure. I think there's an undersea one. I can't remember the name, but it's not Ontong Java Plateau. That's a little bit larger. Now, the Siberian traps, as they're erupting in Siberia and pouring out all this lava all over the place, well, you know what happens with volcanism? Go back to the subduction zone picture, is that water vapor and carbon dioxide are coming out of that volcano, right? So if this major amount of volcanism is occurring, then you can bet that there's a rise in atmospheric carbon dioxide. Okay, so that's not such a big deal. That can't cause a mass extinction. All you're doing is maybe warming the global temperatures a little bit with greenhouse effect by carbon dioxide. Well, also, did I say that volcanism is erupting up through coal? Oops. That's a big one, right? All of this coal that was sequestered during the Carboniferous is now being volatilized by all the magma that's ascending up there, up through it. So this isn't just normal carbon dioxide that's coming out along with volcanism. This is massive amounts of carbon that's being volatilized and liberated, and all this sequestered energy from the sun that was sequestered for 100 million years is being blown back out into the atmosphere. So you have greenhouse gases, a ton of them, right? Well, gigatons, billions of tons. And then you also have energy that's coming back, this ancient sunlight that's coming back out. So you're literally warming the atmosphere with more warming of stuff that's coming out, more combusted material. Okay, now that's minuscule. I don't want to blow that out of proportion. But there is some warming of the atmosphere that's going on, and greenhouse effect by incoming solar rays not being able to escape because of those carbon dioxide molecules. And then lastly, by the globe warming just a little bit more, is methane is released from the methane clathrates of the ocean, the iced methane. And that methane is also a potent greenhouse gas, and then that greenhouse gas is a runaway positive feedback that warms the atmosphere more. So we have a twofold effect. We have a warming situation, or a climactic global warming that's occurring, or global climate change that's led to 10 degrees Celsius increase in average temperatures, huge swing in temperatures. And then also there's so much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that organisms that are not tolerant to high amounts of carbon dioxide they start to die. So we literally get carbon dioxide poisoning or suffocation because of so much CO2 in the atmosphere via volcanism and the eruption, or the eruption up through coal, or the volatilization of all of this carbon dioxide that was once trapped. This is a sad situation, right? This is pretty nasty. This is like all of the worst things happening at once. Well, I guess they didn't get hit by an asteroid, right? Well, some people have proposed that. But this mass extinction was nothing more than a volcanic climate crisis. This is a really good example of volcanism that changed the face of the Earth. Now, yeah, volcanism didn't do it alone. It did it with the sequestered carbon from years before. But this happened over a relatively short amount of geologic time, releasing a lot of this material into the atmosphere. This is what's called the Great Dying. The Great Dying mass extinction, where 95% of all species, all species went extinct. 95% of things that lived before didn't live afterwards. And those 5% of things that did make it through are our ancestors, or all the things that today's living ecology around us are the remnants of that 5% that made it through, that had diversified on the other side. Kind of like when we were talking about Snowball Earth, of those organisms that were there, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? So quite similarly, organisms were able to make it through. So let's talk about the 5 criteria of a mass extinction. Okay, yeah, there's actually criteria to call something a mass extinction. Just because a bunch of stuff dies doesn't mean it's a mass extinction, right? Yeah. So the first criteria is this has to be over 50% of species that are lost. If it's under 50%, then it's not mass, right? Okay, that's an easy one. It also has to be above the background rate of extinction. Wait, what? Background rate of extinction? Yeah. 2 out of every 5 species that evolve in this million years will be extinct in the next million years. It's just a fact of the fossil record. That's what we see by sifting through all this stuff. That business as usual of Earth is for 5 organisms to diversify. 3 of them find out this is successful. 2 of them find out, well, I guess we can't do this for a living, and they die. Okay? So business as usual is for 2 out of 5 species to go extinct. If we see the level of extinction during the event is higher than the background rate of extinction, then we can consider it a mass extinction. So for those types of mass extinctions that are spread out over a couple million years, this is one of those ways where we can compare it to, even though it happened over a longer period of time, that if it's well above the background rate, we can still consider it. It also must be global in scale. Global. It can't just happen in Pittsburgh. Well, okay, not Pittsburgh. It can't just happen in an area that's unnamed of the Earth that is not a city. It can't just happen in the southeast United States. I don't know. Giving a terrible geography example right now. But it can't just happen in one region of the world. It wouldn't be a mass extinction because it's just the area there that would have to deal with that. And the community of life surrounding that would filter into those niches. And the organisms in the fossil record over in China would look exactly the same. It's only in southeastern U.S. that the fossil organisms would change a little bit. And it probably wouldn't change a lot as the same creatures that are in southeast United States or southeast North America are quite common to those or similar to those that are in other areas. So it can't be regional. We won't see that as well illuminated in the fossil record. It has to be global in scale. Next, it has to be rapid. I did discuss this one here, is that the preference is for these things to be boom, like an asteroid impact. Boom, everything changes one day to the next. But also, like the Devonian mass extinction, this happened over a fairly long period of time and even came in 2 pulses. But the end result, even though this wasn't rapid in the end result, each phase of that happened relatively rapidly. Okay? And also, throughout the whole event, it was above the background rate of extinction. It was also global, and more than 50% of species were gone by the end of it. So these are all different criteria for looking at whether we should call this a mass extinction. And now the last one here, it must be broad in taxonomic scope. Taxonomy is the naming of genus and species. It's the naming of organisms. I'm a Homo sapiens. You're a Homo sapiens. We're all Homo sapiens. Yay! Sorry, I couldn't resist myself. Naming species is taxonomy. So what this is saying is that it must be broad amongst the naming scheme of species. This can't just be insects are affected. This can't just be Homo sapiens are affected. This can't just be trees that are affected or just willows. No, this has to be across the taxonomy. Insects are just as affected as clams, are just as affected as primates, are just as affected as shrubs. Everything is affected because this is global in scale, rapid, background rate of extinction, whatever organism you are, and 50% of all species, not just mammals, not just insects, not just plants, but all of the community of life. Now, hopefully, by spelling out the criteria here and showing you just how specific these events have to be to consider it a mass extinction, shows you just how big these things are, and exceptional they are, and rare they are. But yet there's been 5 of them in the last 550 million years. Since the Cambrian explosion of life, there's been 5 times that there's been a mass extinction. 5 times where the Earth has lost 50% or more of the species that it evolved. 5 times that a broad taxonomic group of species or broad taxonomy of species has globally gone extinct relatively quickly. So these are big things that are occurring here. Now, of those big things, I think us as humans, as Homo sapiens, who are doing this weird thing, like digitally talking to you like 4 hours, 12 hours in the future whenever you watch this video, our weird brains and our intelligence offers us the capabilities to understand these big 5 events, right? To not only have searched out all the evidence and to come up with this criteria to see what the heck was going on, but also to really see what the heck was going on. Why did these things occur? Why would we ask those questions and be so concerned about that? Well, maybe so we can not prevent, but discourage from the same things occurring in the future. To see the early warning signs when these things are occurring, so we don't have a mass extinction. Or hell, even just a minimal extinction, right? I mean, this is pretty bad on the large scale and has millions of years of ramifications. Even just a small thing could seem to perturb our very sensitive global situation. So I think knowing about these big 5 is the first step in knowing about the no-nos of ecology, right? What do you not want to do if you don't want to destroy life on Earth? Well, clearly one of those is don't get hit by an asteroid. How are we going to solve that one, right? That's kind of hard. We did address the other day the idea of the little of weight or mass on both sides of the asteroids and kind of nudging it along away from the Earth. That's a possibility. But that would never be a possibility if we didn't think about it being a problem. Why did we think about it being a problem? Because an asteroid wiped out the dinosaurs. That's why. Now, if an asteroid wiped out the dinosaurs and we see that as dangerous, what about the Devonian extinction? What did we learn about there? That nutriating the ocean and eutrophication of the ocean can lead to major land devastation, land organism devastation, by perturbing the oceanic system, right? So eutrophication, disturbing the oceanic ecology or making it essentially lower amounts of life. Okay, so let's see what other mass extinctions we can learn about. Okay, so here are the big 5, as they're called. The Ordovician-Silurian mass extinction, we won't talk much about here. Remember, there was frickin' snails around during that time. Okay, it's a big deal. Lots of snails went extinct, but it's not one that I'm terribly well versed in or that we have a whole lot of record of. And that, remember, this is ocean-based organisms. There's no land-based organisms during this time. So the global scale, broad taxonomic scope thing is very limited to marine organisms. The late Devonian extinction we just went over. The Permo-Triassic mass extinction we also just covered. The Triassic-Jurassic mass extinction I'll say a couple words about. The Cretaceous-Paleogene mass extinction, now that one you know really well. Again, this is the one that if you've ever heard about a mass extinction before, it's that one that you've heard about. And really, interestingly, that's the most recent of them. And also, that's not nearly the biggest of them, right? And then I add one more on here. The Anthropocene-Apocalypticene mass extinction. Now, this is not a real event. This is a speculated event. There's a book, I think Elizabeth Colbert, I think is her name. There's a book called The Sixth Mass Extinction. And this has gotten wide criticism from many varieties of the scientific community, exclaiming, we are not going through a mass extinction right now. We are not. We are not. We are not. We are not. Okay, understandably, we are not experiencing a mass extinction right now. But what I and others would argue for about this type of idea is that we are certainly laying the foundations of the possibility for mass extinction to occur, whether we're here tomorrow or not. Say we go away tomorrow. We've already laid the groundwork for potentially that to occur by ecological devastation. Now, this is something we'll get to later, right? This isn't part of the 5 big mass extinctions we're here to discuss today, even though it'll come up another 1 or 2 times. All right, so here we go. Ordovician Silurian mass extinction is chalked up to a climactic change event. Okay, so watch out for those. If you don't want to go extinct or to kill all of Earth, watch out for climactic changes that can be really big. And then, of course, we saw during the late Devonian that plants themselves, life itself, organic acids, can change the face of the Earth so much that they can lead to mass extinction events. So organic acids producing increased erosion, increased ocean cations, and then massive algal blooms leading to eutrophication of the ocean. The Permo-Triassic mass extinction, the large igneous province of volcanism in the Siberian traps, erupted up through coal, and there was a rapid increase in carbon dioxide. And we're talking like 9,000 parts per million in the atmosphere during this time. Okay, not just a simple rise, not that today's rise is a simple rise by any means, but it's on 2 orders of magnitude larger than we're talking about today. Then the Triassic-Jurassic mass extinction is one of the main hypotheses is that this was created by a double asteroid impact. Yeah, 2 of them occurred. Each one of them were not as big as the next mass extinction, is the asteroid that occurred during this time. But again, this is adding insult to injury, right? Something happens, the globe is in tatters, and then another thing happens, and that's the icing on the cake, so they say. The Cretaceous-Paleogene mass extinction, also another asteroid impact, the main, mother of them all. And then today, there are many factors in why we might consider today the 6th mass extinction, mostly rooted in overconsumption by our population, by Homo sapiens. So again, in this Retallack 1999 article, Mass Extinction, Life's Revolutions, Retallack again brings that up as the late Quaternary mass extinction by overpopulation. But here we have a pretty succinct table that's showing us the causes of mass extinctions, and then if there's any associated crater with those. And for a very long time, and I think it's still argued in the literature, that the late Devonian extinction was caused by multiple asteroid impacts, and that there's several craters associated with those. But I think the timing of all of these doesn't work out very well with the Devonian extinction. It is quite possible that the asteroid impact was another icing on the cake type of situation with these, and led to further taxonomic death. All right, final couple of points here about mass extinctions. So first of all, there are the 5 criteria. I want you to know those really well. Then there are the 5 main mass extinctions themselves, which are up here. And again, how do we know about these? Okay, that's a rhetorical question. I'm going to answer it myself. Is because the fossil record shows us that rocks of this age contain all of these plethora of fossils, and then rocks on this side, nothing has changed about the rock, but all of a sudden the fossil assemblage looks different. And that's a really good area to draw a boundary to say those rocks are different from those ones, those are Devonian, and those are Carboniferous. Or in some cases, those are Paleozoic and those are Mesozoic. It's the appearance or absence of fossils in the record that lead us to building the geologic timescale. Okay, so how do we know about mass extinctions? It's by the mass disappearance of fossils that were so prolific beforehand. Okay, now the last point about a mass extinction is a really optimistic one. Optimistic. What can be optimistic about a mass extinction? Well, remember that you and I standing here today, not only are we part of that 5% of species that made it through the Great Dying, not 5% of species, excuse me. We are the, what do you call those? Our ancestors, let's just start there, our ancestors of species, our ancestors in life, were of that 5% that made it through the Great Dying, or the Permo-Triassic mass extinction. And then yet again, during the Triassic-Jurassic, and then yet again, during the most recent asteroid impact 65 million years ago. The mammals that made it through, those that were hiding in the subsurface from the nuclear winter, that were able to be omnivorous and eat multiple things, and to eat decaying matter, and to team up even with fungi, like things like ants, who can grow fungi underneath the ground. Organisms like those were able to make it through and then repopulate the earth. And we, you and I, Homo sapiens, as well as, the deer and the coyote and the mosquito, are all products of this mass extinction, and then this one, and then this one, and then this one, and then this one, and we still stand here today. So again, going back to that concept of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Now, I don't want to take that too literally, but this is a decent example to show that life can be taken down a notch, but will re-proliferate. And then, in fact, that taking down notch can be an opportunity for re-proliferation. So organisms that were, dominating the scene, and then other organisms that really, couldn't do much because the organisms that were dominating the scene were dominating the scene. If those things go extinct, then these other organisms now are allowed new niches to diversify into. So we get this new diversification of life out of something that may never have diversified if the other terror birds or the other terror lizards, dinosaurs, would have still ruled the scene. So what I'm getting to here is that you and I, as mammals were nothing but tiny little scourging species during the Mesozoic, trying to stay out of the dinosaurs' way. And if it wasn't for the dinosaurs dying, mammals may have never gotten their chance to do what we do today, for better or for worse. Now, so mass extinctions are opportunities for other organisms to proliferate, just like you and I as mammals. And then later in the course, I'll come back to the same image, and I'll suggest that the Anthropocene Apocalypticene is an opportunity for fungi. Okay? So that's the end of Violent Earth today. That rally of mass extinctions, kind of going a little bit through the history of life, not in too much detail, but just enough for us so we know enough about life, about it being a big deal when it gets destroyed or when it gets violently extinct. Okay, so we will, next week, we will pick up again with this theme that we've been on of life, but we'll start to see what the diversification and evolutionary processes look like. We are going to come back in the rest of the course to big things like supervolcanoes, quite possibly, and then catastrophic floods, which is coming up really soon. And then also sticking to that theme of life is how does life affect its environment, right? And then how does our environment affect life? Okay, there's sort of a brief roadmap for the next couple of weeks. Stay tuned for your next Violent Earth grip of material. All right, see you later.